Okay, it's time to start our final session of the day, which I think has been a fascinating day. I'll just move to the left so I'm in view of the camera. But we've got one final equally interesting, fascinating topic to conclude the day. As we know, then during the medieval period, the role of the church was an important element in the governance of the country, perhaps timely with the announcement this week of the first female Archbishop of Canterbury. And it's a pleasure to welcome Ian Bass, Dr. Ian Bass, who is familiar to many of you. Whilst studying for his PhD at Manchester Metropolitan University, Ian became the winner of our inaugural essay prize. And Ian, in fact, holds the distinction of being the only person to have won the essay prize twice. Ian has continued his research and his publications, particularly working on the miraculous cult of St. Thomas de Cantilupe, Bishop of Hereford. So it's a great pleasure. Oh, and I should just add, Ian is now a trustee of the Society. So it's a great pleasure to have Ian to talk today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Philip. And I hope you are all refreshed, having had a cup of tea or a cup of coffee particularly perhaps to keep you awake during the next 45 minutes or so. But it occurred to me over the course of today that this talk will actually overlap quite a lot with what the previous speakers have all been saying, from David's fantastic survey of Magna Carta and how 1225 is the definitive edition, Andrew's account of Parliament, Helen and Paul's fantastic conversation, and then Kath's use of records and who was writing records and where they were kept. So, hopefully this could be a good reminder then of what you have all heard and learned about today. During the 11th century and 12th century, the English Church, led by its bishops, 16 of them and 2 archbishops, had established themselves as a leading player in the political community of England. Archbishops and bishops were not just the spiritual leaders of the realm, but they also played important parts as leaders of armies and as feudal lords in their own right. In 1190, for example, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Baldwin of Ford, and the Bishop of Salisbury, Hubert Walter, who we heard about from Kath, had gone on the Third Crusade. And both bishops played a prominent part in the Siege of Acre as military strategists and leaders of the English crusading army in the king's stead. Or, again, as David mentioned this morning, in 1217, you have the contribution of Peter de Roche, the Bishop of Winchester, at the Battle of Lincoln. And it was de Roche who made the royalist win possible by stealing into the city, reconnoitering an infiltration route, and then riding into battle with William Marshall. Having said that, contemporary satire was far less flattering with de Roche, describing him as the warrior of Winchester, up at the exchequer, good at finance, slack at the Gospels. Likewise, bishops had, on occasion, been emboldened to keep the power of the king in check, with disagreement followed by the bishop's exile, not an uncommon occurrence. The Archbishop of Canterbury, for instance, Anselm of Becket, was exiled twice either side of the turn of the 12th century, following opposition to William Rufus and Henry I. And it is perhaps Archbishop Thomas Becket of Canterbury who provides the best example of the tension between political and spiritual service experienced by senior churchmen at this time. Becket's antagonisms of King Henry II were perhaps in part provoked by what he saw as the king's encroachment on ecclesiastical liberties. And it was these encroachments that were famously codified in the 1164 Constitutions of Clarendon, in which the king sought to restrict ecclesiastical privilege and the power of the church's courts, made famous in particular by the clause in the constitutions against criminous clerks. It was an attempt by the secular state to make the English clergy subject to secular rather than ecclesiastical courts for crimes such as murder. And it's the fight between church and state that, of course, resulted in Becket's death, his exile, his eventual return, and then his murder and martyrdom in the Cathedral Church of Canterbury on the 29th of December, 1170. The role of English bishops as mediators and participants on the political stage saw them attempting to use their spiritual power then to rein in the secular power of the king. And it was no different half a century after Becket's martyrdom with Magna Carta. From the latter years of King John's reign through to that of his sons Henry III, England's bishops held a prominent place at the heart of English political life and political events. And this includes the making of Magna Carta, or, as David rightly pointed out this morning, I should probably say the Charter of Runnymede in 1215. And that charter in particular is the one heralded as the pivotal moment in English constitutional history. And it was one in which Archbishop Stephen Langton of Canterbury was a principal architect. The bishops throughout the 13th century continued to play a role in the charter's rebirth following its papal annulment and its subsequent entrenchment in society throughout the period. Over the years, historians have sought to bring the role of the church to the fore in terms of their role in the making and enforcement of Magna Carta. In particular, some of the recent examinations of the last decade, heralded in particular by the Arts and Humanities Research Council Magna Carta project, have highlighted the Church's central role in the production, preservation, and proclamation of Magna Carta during the period. Studies, not least by the late great Björn Weiler, along with David Carpenter, Nick Vincent, John Madicott, David Davry, and Richard Helmholtz, have laid the foundations for new studies exploring the Church's role. Foremost, of course, amongst those examinations are the formidable and brilliant works of Sophie Ambler and Felicity Hill. And I will admit it is from their impressive scholarship that this talk takes very, very heavy inspiration. Ambler's works in particular have focused on the central role of English bishops in the production and enforcement and the promotion of Magna Carta throughout the period, with an especial focus on the 1265 reissue under the conciliar government led under the leadership of Simon de Montfort. Felicity Hill similarly has focused on the bishops, but this time in terms of their role as enforcers of the Charter, using excommunication and their role in pastoral care. And she has demonstrated that to infringe the Charter's terms was to put one's soul at the greatest of jeopardy. So as such, it was the Church's job to remind people then and remind the laity about the danger of infringing the Charter, both locally and nationally through the use of ecclesiastical censure. The importance of the Church's association with Magna Carta in the 13th century is not just necessarily demonstrated by the fact that the first lines start with the King's greeting, the preamble, headed by the archbishops, bishops, and abbots, ahead of the barons and knights, nor the fact that the very first clause of the Charter set out that the English Church is to be free. And it's not even by the fact that the Church was the primary custodian of the Charter in the localities, though that isn't to say that these aren't all important points, as we shall see over the course of this talk. But rather, as Sophie Ambler and Felicity Hill have both shown, it's the fact that the Church was inextricably linked with Magna Carta and its enforcement, finding the ways and the means in which to keep the king in check and within the Charter's limitations. And in particular, as we saw this morning from David's talk, the Church found this role as enforcer of the Charter from the reissue of 1225, which of course is at the centre of our conference today in the 800th anniversary of its issue. The 1225 Magna Carta, as was said, is important precisely because it is the definitive version of the Charter that ended up being reissued throughout the rest of the 13th century, and it was the one that went on to the statute book. On the other hand, this issue's origins were far less infamous than the first. The 1225 Charter, as we have seen, was granted by the king in return for a tax, compared, of course, to the baronial rebellion that then resulted in the sealing of the original at Runnymede in 1215. However, England's bishops had played the important role in this reissue of the Charter, not least because it was the first time since 1215 that a means of enforcement, a way to keep the king under the Charter's limitations, was put forward, and thus set an important precedent thereafter. So, in 1225, along with its companion charter, the Charter of the Forest, which re-established the rights of access for free men to the royal forest, were confirmed in return for taxes, and at the height of this confirmation, it was the bishops, led by Archbishop Stephen Langton, who pronounced a sentence of excommunication against anyone who had infringed the Charter. And it was a pattern that would then be followed on numerous occasions thereafter, notably, of course, in 1237, 1253, 1270, and 1297. The Church were not only the custodians of the charters, they were the enforcers, assuming an ideologically significant role tied to their implementation and the holding of the king to account under both secular and spiritual law. Stephen Langton, of course, as we heard from David this morning, he was Archbishop of Canterbury between 1207 to 1228, and he had been one of the architects of the 1215 Magna Carta. He was the man who shuttled between the king's tents and the barons in their dwellings to broker a peace at Runnymede. And it was Stephen Langton who was the mastermind of this move. As David Davry has shown, Stephen Langton's own theological education and studies was the thing that gives support for his demonstrable expectation that limitations should be placed on the king. Langton had been instrumental in the making of this original charter, and then in the reissuing of it in 1216 and 1217, when it turned from rebellious demands into royal manifesto. The reason why Stephen Langton came up with this idea of excommunication for these early reissues was because early on in Henry III's reign, they had removed the thorny and controversial Clause 61. It's the infamous security for peace, which established the Council of 25 Barons to cause to be observed with all their might the peace and liberties granted and confirmed to them by this charter. The charters then in 1216 and 1217 were in many ways toothless, perhaps. Sure, the king was 9 and 10 during those years, and government was run by the regency under the papal legate and William Marshal. But equally, they were charters with no means of enforcement once the king was in his majority. So therefore, Langton's use of excommunication in 1225 seems to be a stroke of absolute genius. It set a precedent for his successors, and it encouraged a culture in which the bishops themselves of England and their clergy were duty-bound to oversee royal governance and to keep the king's rule within law. And it is to a scene of excommunication that I would like to take you to now. The best idea that we have for what might have happened in 1225 comes from the description offered by the 13th century chronicler Matthew Paris, who described the Great Assembly and reissue of Magna Carta that occurred 12 years later in 1237. Paris records that this meeting took place in St. Catherine's Chapel at Westminster Abbey, with the king surrounded by his barons and bishops, the latter of whom were holding lighted candles. And the scene described by Paris is up on the board, and it runs like this. In the days in which the blessed Edmund ruled the Church of Canterbury, now this is Edmund of Abingdon, who was one of Stephen Langton's pupils and was successor as Archbishop of Canterbury between 1233 and 1240. So when Blessed Edmund ruled the Church of Canterbury, a certain contribution was granted to the king according to his desire and request. The same king swore, holding his right hand over the most holy Gospels, and in his left hand a lighted candle, while the Archbishop recited the oath, that without any argument he would from that time inviolably observe the charter so often granted to the faithful, nor would he allow himself to be ensnared by the customary deceits of whispers. Likewise, also many bishops who were then present, holding burning candles, together with the said Archbishop, excommunicated all violators of the same charter and those interpreting it perversely. And at the completion of the pronounced sentence, when by all and even by the king himself, as is custom, let it be done, was repeated, and extinguished candles had been cast down and thrown aside, and stinking and smoking produced offense to the nostrils and eyes of those standing around, the Archbishop said, "Thus let the condemned souls of those who either violate the said charter or interpret it perversely be extinguished, give off smoke and stink." And it was shouted by all, but by the king more often and more eagerly, "Amen, Amen." Now, this extremely vivid and dramatic piece of ritualistic theatre intended quite vividly to imprint the threat of excommunication, and of course, by extension, the Church's role as the enforcer of the sentence, upon the memory of all of those who were then present through sight, sound, and smell. It was one that warned those who were to violate the Charter's terms of the stark spiritual danger that they were in. The smoke and scent of extinguished wicks reminding those present of the everlasting damnation that they would face through stinging eyes and acrid stench. It's probably a similar scene to this that had been played out in 1225, when it was Langton who oversaw the proceedings and first instituted the practice of excommunication. And from 1225, the duty to enforce Magna Carta was one that English bishops took very seriously. In 1234, for instance, just 3 years before this scene that was described, when Henry III had for some time cast off the principles of Magna Carta, it was Archbishop Edmund and his brother bishops who had confronted the king in Parliament with a catalogue of royal misdeeds and had threatened to excommunicate him unless he mended his ways. It was a threat that the king ended up taking to heart, for he repented of all of his unjust actions and bent to the Archbishop's counsel. 3 years later then, in 1237, the excommunication ritual that we have, described by Matthew Paris, seems to have been a timely reminder for the king to maintain Magna Carta, especially for during that same year, the king and a number of his barons had sought absolution from the Archbishop for fear of having violated the charter and having already fallen under a sentence of excommunication. And as stated before, this was a scene that continued to play out throughout the 13th century, though the most notable occasion probably did come in 1253, when there was a growing secular and ecclesiastical dissent against the king. As has been noted in scholarship by David Carpenter and Felicity Hill, the 1253 reissue was particularly important from the Church's perspective, primarily because it was the Church and, it was the bishops and their clergy who had made the strenuous efforts to push for the reissue at the preceding parliaments. They were also the ones who both published Magna Carta and its accompanying sentence of excommunication, both widely in the parishes. This had stemmed from the fact that the top of the agenda of parliaments in 1252 and 1253 was the issue of taxation. The king wanted to raise both a secular tax for his forthcoming expedition to Gascony, as well as an ecclesiastical tax for his proposed crusade to the Holy Land. And on the 13th of May 1253, in the Great Hall of Westminster, Magna Carta was confirmed once more, and in no less dramatic fashion than 1225 and 1237. Once again, Matthew Paris, that great 13th century chronicler, was probably there and recorded the event. Also in attendance this time were 5 earls, a number of the barons, 13 of England's 16 bishops, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the charter of his father John was brought forth into the midst, in which the same King John again, by mere will, granted and caused to be recited the aforesaid liberties. But when the king had heard the aforesaid sentence, he held his hand to his breast, and with a serene and willing and eager expression. And when at the end they had cast down and extinguished the smoking candles, and it was said by each, "Thus let the attackers of this sentence be extinguished and stink in hell," and bells were rung, the king himself also said, "So may God help me, I will faithfully keep these things inviolate, as I am a man, as I am a Christian, as I am a knight, and as I am a king crowned and anointed." And it must be known that at the beginning of the sentence about to be pronounced, when burning candles were handed to all, one was also handed to the king. And when he received it, he did not wish to hold it, but he handed it off to one of the prelates, saying, "It is not fitting for me to hold such a candle, for I am not a priest, but the heart gives greater testimony." Important here, then, is the fact that both lay and ecclesiastical magnates had joined together in such a powerful way, with Paris's account seemingly indicating that instead of just the bishops, as in 1237, candles were held by everybody except the king in Westminster that day. The bishops had pushed for the reissue of Magna Carta and were the driving force behind this confirmation. And joining in this vivid and dramatic way with the baronage, it perhaps made the realm seem as if it was one, according to John Madicott. Yet, as David Carpenter stated in his book on Henry III, it also ended up showing the great tensions present between church and state, since overall many of the church's grievances that had been raised at the preceding parliaments were dismissed out of hand. And the only real success that the church actually had at that time was getting the king to grant Magna Carta once more in return for a crusading tax. Tensions also become apparent when you consider the publication of the sentence of excommunication and the distribution of the charter. It was not the king, but the keeper of the king's seal who ended up taking responsibility 2 days later when they sent a letter on the 15th of May to royal officials commanding them to observe the charters. The king seemingly bided his time and considered his response, for it took him over a month on June 23rd for him to finally take some action and order the sheriffs in the localities to obey Magna Carta. Perhaps from Henry's perspective, one could see that the church had overstepped its mark. The king and the magnates ended up issuing their own proclamations after this, and it said that during the sentence of excommunication, the king had, with his own mouth, reserved the ancient customs of the kingdom and the rights of the crown. Additionally, it was said that the king, magnates, and the community of the people had publicly protested before the bishops that anything not included in their own declaration that was just being published had been fabricated by the prelates and was not consented to. Yet, on the church's side, Magna Carta and the sentence of excommunication was published widely, and efforts were taken to preserve it. While there had been sentences issued, as we've seen, in 1225 and 1237, this time, the bishops spelt everything out in far more detail and far more publicly than they had before. They required the excommunication and Magna Carta to be published in every parish church on Sundays and festival days. This publication was to be accompanied by the ringing of bells and the burning of candles. and one can only imagine that it was perhaps a miniature performance of that enacted in Westminster Abbey in order to remind everybody in the localities that they, like the barons and like the king, should not violate the Charter's terms. Bishop Robert Grosseteste of Lincoln was also active and required the clergy in the Diocese of Lincoln to recite the sentence of excommunication with crosses and handbells in secular courts, just perhaps as an added reminder. Importantly, in 1254, the Pope confirmed this sentence of excommunication at the insistence of the English bishops, and he even ordered that this proclamation of excommunication should be issued in both English and French. To infringe Magna Carta, then, was not merely meant to be understood just by the church, by the king, by the barons and those who knew Latin, but indeed by every layman in their own vernacular tongue. Magna Carta was therefore brought to a broad audience with this reissue, to shire courts and parish churches, to the unfree as well as the free, and to women as well as men. The recitation of Magna Carta and accompanying sentences of excommunication in localities were not the only ways in which the church reminded people of it. Mandates had routinely been issued throughout the period for copies of the Charter to be displayed in cathedrals and in churches, and it is the church who seems to have been one of the primary preservers of the Charter. Certainly, when it was first sealed in 1215, it seems that King John might have hoped that if only a few copies had been made by royal chancery scribes, for the full final version of the document had been calculated to take over 8 hours to copy in full, then maybe, just maybe, it might disappear. Perhaps John might have thought that the less people knew about the Charter of Runnymede, the better it would be for him. Through the Magna Carta project, David Carpenter, Nicholas Vincent, and Teresa Weber have compared the scribal hands of hundreds of charters produced by King John's Chancery, as well as those from the households of English bishops in the period. From their conclusions, it seems likely that 3 of the 4 1215 final copies, known as engrossments, were preserved in cathedrals, with perhaps 2 related, written by scribes related to the respective cathedral. Carpenter has convincingly shown that of the 2 Magna Cartae that survive in the British Library, one had originally been sent to Canterbury Cathedral. And according to Nick Vincent, both British Library engrossments were written by Chancery scribes. On the other hand, the 2 survivals, one at Salisbury and one at Lincoln, seem to have been, the latter of which with Lincoln, it's on display in the castle rather than the cathedral, might have been penned by scribes at their respective episcopal household, or at least a scribe from the area and not one associated with the usual operation of the Royal Chancery. According to the Annals of Dunstable Priory in Bedfordshire, the charters were deposited throughout each bishopric in a safe place. A small list on the reverse of the patent rolls dated to June 1215 accounts for a total of 13 engrossments of Magna Carta that were distributed. So the Bishop of Lincoln is listed as having received 2 copies of the Charter, the Bishop of Worcester 1, and Elias of Dereham, a canon and architect at Salisbury Cathedral, received 10. As suggested by Carpenter, the second of the 2 given to the Bishop of Lincoln was likely destined for the Diocese of Bath and Wells, where the bishop's brother at the time, Jocelyn of Wells, was bishop. And additionally, it was E4 Rowlands that had first suggested that the number of engrossments that we know of at the time, the 13, directly correlates to the number of bishops known to have been in place in their diocese in 1215. The church then seemed to have become the primary custodians of Magna Carta, and once the engrossment was safely housed at the cathedral, it could then be inspected and copied, with copies perhaps being distributed throughout the diocese and the county. And it might be for this reason that a number of cathedrals still retain a copy of Magna Carta today. In total, there are some 26 formal final copies or engrossments as single sheets of parchment that survive from the 13th century. Almost a third of these, a total of 8, survive or are associated with preservation at a cathedral. So as I've just said, from 1215 we have 4 exemplars. We have the 2 in the British Library, 1 at Lincoln and 1 at Salisbury, with 3 having known associations with cathedrals. So 1 at Canterbury, 1 at Lincoln and 1 at Salisbury Cathedral. Singular engrossment survives from 1216 in Durham Cathedral, and it was likely the exemplar that had been sent there for the County Palatine of Durham. And that Magna Carta, as well as the 2 others that Durham have been on display this year as part of their Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest exhibition, which there's a link on this slide to. 4 engrossments survive from the 1217 issue. Hereford Cathedral holds one, as well as a copy of the writ of 1215 from King John, with orders on how Magna Carta was supposed to be enacted in the localities, indicating that perhaps at one point the cathedral may have held an original 1215 Magna Carta. The remaining 3 1217s are all in the Bodleian Library. 2 are suggested to be from the monastic house of Osney Abbey in Oxfordshire, and 1 is from Gloucester Abbey, now Gloucester Cathedral. The 3rd of these, from Gloucester, was suggested by Nicholas Vincent to have been made by the same scribe who had been involved in the 1215 Lincoln Magna Carta, and who we know was still present in the household of the Bishop of Lincoln, Hugh of Wells, during that year. Of 1225, there are also 4 engrossments. Durham Cathedral has its 2nd, which, as I said, has been on display this year. The British Library copy is suggested to have originally been in the possession of Laycock Abbey and might have been the exemplar that had been sent to Wiltshire. The National Archives has its first Magna Carta, which is associated with the Duchy of Lancaster and is probably from one of the counties there. And the Bodleian holds another, which Nick Vincent thinks originally may have been from either Hereford or Lincoln, the latter being his favoured suggestion because of the survival of a 1225 Charter of the Forest in Lincoln, indicating that it would have also received a copy of the 1225 Magna Carta. Unfortunately, no engrossments survive of the Inspeximus or confirmation of the 1265 Magna Carta, but there are several copies in various different forms. Important here, perhaps, is this edition that was recorded in the register of Bishop Richard de Swinfield of Hereford, which I had a very small hand in bringing to light and bringing to the attention of the Magna Carta project some 14 years ago. It's likely that this copy of Magna Carta that wound up in Swinfield's register could have been brought to Hereford by Swinfield's predecessor in post, Thomas de Cantilupe, who had been Keeper of the King's Seal and Chancellor of the Realm during the Montfortian Conciliar government. And, importantly, it was Cantilupe who had been the one to seal this issue of the Charter. In fact, when talking about differences between the charters this morning, the sealing clause of the 1265 Magna Carta is one that is quite unique, insofar that it is the only one of the few issues of Magna Carta where the sealing clause lists somebody other than the king as the one who gave the charter, and specifically records that it was given by the hand of Master Thomas de Cantilupe, our Chancellor. And I particularly love the small sort of scribble doodle on the register's pages of a head of a bishop looking out on Magna Carta. Perhaps it might have been either a bored scribe or it could be somebody sort of thinking of Thomas Cantilupe and his role beforehand in it. In 1297 and 1300, the royal chancery became far more involved, producing all of the known engrossments. The 4 from 1297 are those at Washington National Archives in America, which was the one that was sent to Buckinghamshire, London Metropolitan Archives, which was sent, of course, to London, Canberra's Parliament House in Australia has the exemplar that was sent to Surrey and which had originally been housed at Easebourne Priory in Sussex. And the National Archives in London holds another, and again, this time, it's still associated with the Duchy of Lancaster. Finally, there are 8 from 1300. London Metropolitan Archives holds the one that was sent to the City of London. Durham Cathedral has its 3rd, which again would have been sent to the county and then preserved at the cathedral. Oriel College in Oxford holds one that likely came from the archives of St. Mary's, the University Church of the University of Oxford, of which Oriel has been a patron since the college's foundation. Faversham Borough Archives has the one that was sent to the Cinque Port town of Faversham. Westminster Abbey holds that for Wiltshire. Maidstone Kent Archives has the one that was sent to the Cinque Port of Sandwich and which was discovered by Nick Vincent and David Carpenter in 2014. And the Oxford Bodleian has another one from Osney Abbey, which, although I said that the Royal Chancery had made all the copies, based on the evidence of the seals attached to this one, the Osney Abbey Charter may have been produced by the Abbey itself rather than the Royal Chancery. Now, of course, I've mentioned that there were 8 and there are only 7 on the board here, which of course brings us to the fact that this year another Magna Carta was sort of revealed by Professors Carpenter and Vincent, who confirmed that the Magna Carta at Harvard Law School in America was an original engrossment. They managed, as we have seen this morning, to follow that documentary trail back to Appleby and Westmoreland. Also, please do forgive that headline from the BBC there. Harvard Law School, I think it was Andrew who had mentioned it. So Harvard Law School had paid $27.50 in 1946, the equivalent of about £7 back then for what they believed to be an unofficial copy. Whereas the last engrossment that was sold was that in 2007, which was the 1297 Magna Carta in Washington National Archive, which went for $21.7 million, or £10.5 million in 2007. So the question of why the Church would go to such lengths to support the Charter in both enforcement and preservation is one that seemingly has a ready answer. And that answer lies in the fact that the Church and its clergy were major beneficiaries of Magna Carta and its clauses. Clause 1 of the Charter specifically had secured the English Church's freedom in the choice of its own bishops and abbots. As originally written in 1215, and perhaps as some scholars have suggested, written maybe by Stephen Langton himself, first, that we have granted to God, and by this our present charter have confirmed for us and for our heirs in perpetuity, that the English Church shall be free, and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. That we wish this to be so observed appears from the fact that of our own free will, before the outbreak of the present dispute between us and our barons, we granted and confirmed the by charter, the freedom of the Church's elections, a right reckoned to be of the greatest necessity and importance to it, and caused this to be confirmed by Pope Innocent III. This freedom we shall observe ourselves, and desire to be observed in good faith by our heirs in perpetuity. The irony, however, behind this clause is perhaps self-evident. For King John had incurred a papal sentence of interdict for not allowing Stephen Langton, the Pope's candidate for Archbishop of Canterbury, to take up post, who had been put forward after the monks of the cathedral and the king had put forward rival candidates and couldn't agree on who should take up post. This clause, of course, was refined far more in the later reissues of Magna Carta, with 1225 simply reading, "In the first place we have granted to God, by this our present charter, confirmed for us and for our heirs forever, that the English Church shall be free and have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired." And importantly, as much as we have talked about differences in clauses and differences in structure in Magna Carta, the difference being 1215 had 63 clauses and 1225 goes down to 37, Clause 1 never loses its preeminent place at the start of the Charter. However, the results of Clause 1 did not always work entirely, perhaps as the bishops and clergy may have hoped. Its effectiveness was generally undercut by the king's power to use royal system of postulation and consultation that was available to them to interfere in the church's electoral rights. The imposition of foreign favourites of by the king to the church had been a major point of contention, and it was one that led bishops in the mid-13th century, such as Robert Grosseteste and Bishop Walter de Cantilupe of Worcester, to end up tying their fortunes to the proposed reforms of the Montfortian cause in the 1250s. Additionally, future statutes brought forward by the king, like the statute at Mortmain in Edward I's reign, which sought to prevent land from being given away indefinitely to the dead hand of religious corporations, or the Statute of Provisors in Edward III's reign, which enacted that episcopal elections should be free, and if the papacy used its rights to make institutions to benefices, those rights would revert back to the king, undermined the vagaries of the Charter's wording, and the Crown ended up successfully arguing its case each time that the new statutes were not covered by Clause 1 of Magna Carta. Further clauses within the Charter also safeguarded the specific material interests of the Church and its clergy, which would have encouraged their support for the Charter and its subsequent reissue. As noted by Andrew this morning, Clause 14, for instance, in the 1215 Charter, promised that archbishops, bishops, and abbots would individually be summoned by letter to assemblies to discuss the matters of tax, and they would then be given sufficient lead time of at least 40 days' notice to be able to make their attendance possible. Clause 22, which did go into 1225 as Clause 14, limited the power of the Crown to levy an amercement, a judicial penalty against the clergy. No ecclesiastical person shall be amerced according to the amount of his ecclesiastical benefice, but in accordance with his lay holding and in accordance with the degree of the offence. Clause 60, which went on into 1225 as Clause 37, also recognised that the clergy had their own rights and liberties under English customary law, and it promised that they would be respected in future practice. Moreover, the Charter covered a wide range of clerical rights as well as baronial. The clergy were, in particular, surely among those free men so frequently mentioned as recipients of respect and rights in Magna Carta. These rights, of course, are mentioned specifically in 1215 in clauses 14, 15, 20, 22, and 39, although this did reduce ever so slightly to clauses 10, 14, and 29 in 1225. And although the clergy were not the sole beneficiaries as free men for these clauses, they still stood to gain by enforcement of them. The last in particular, perhaps Clause 39, that went on to be 29 in 1225, the famous, "To no one will we refuse or delay right or justice." The clergy then were amongst the free men whose protections these clauses endorsed. And with some reason then, the church, perhaps as a body, could be reasonably believed that their own interests would be supported and protected by the enforcement of Magna Carta's terms. Overall, English bishops in the 13th century were in a unique place to be able to act in this way. They were peculiarly powerful in respect to their king and uniquely qualified to confront illegal royal actions with the threat of spiritual censure. When the king acted illegally, refusing to follow due process or to consult his magnates and bishops or abbots, or had provoked his barons to rebellion, it was the bishops who could use their political clout and the mechanisms at their disposal to intervene and bring the king to bear. They could operate as well as peacemakers, as I've mentioned about Stephen Langton in 1215, who at Runnymede helped to broker the peace, bringing the king and the barons together. And it was Ralph of Coggeshall who described how King John and his men remained in the royal pavilions, the barons remained in their tents. And it was the Archbishop and his men who shuttled back and forth, trying to negotiate the settlement. Bishops, as peacemakers, of course, were not mere go-betweens, but it required a profound level of authority that was drawn from the charisma of the archiepiscopal office, as well as the trust of the king and barons. Bishops, too, in this period also had the ritual power to chastise kings, as well as to purge them of their faults. In 1213, for example, in front of Winchester Cathedral, a very penitent King John had thrown himself at the bishop's feet, begging for forgiveness for the sins that he had committed against the church and the kingdom. The bishops who were then present lifted him from the ground, took him into the cathedral, and got the king to swear to defend the church and her clergy, maintain the laws of his kingdom, and to provide justice. Essentially, the bishops had the power to get the king to swear again and renew his coronation oath. Likewise, in 1234, Edmund of Abingdon as archbishop rebuked the king. For between 1232 and 1233, the king had given orders acting according to his own will and without judgment, thus violating his office by custom, as well as breaking the terms guaranteed by Magna Carta. The king's response in the face of ecclesiastical censure was one of humbleness and penitence. He went on to rectify the wrongs he committed. So the 13th century then was one in which saw a significant strengthening of the role and rights of the English church and its bishops. As noted in this talk and demonstrated in particular by the works of Sophie Ambler and Felicity Hill listed on the board there, central to this political culture in the 13th century was the spiritual power that bishops used. Since it was this power and authority that was important it was as important in keeping the king to the terms of Magna Carta as it was the barons' and knights' ability to refuse grants of taxation or to enter in rebellion. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Ian. An excellent talk to conclude the afternoon. Brilliant reminder of the Church's role in shaping Magna Carta and the thinking behind it, but also its role in enforcing it, and also the benefits that the Church received from it. We've got time for some questions if there are any. So hands up, or or people at home to put your questions in the chat.
You mentioned at one point that the sheriffs were encouraged to implement or respect the terms set out in the charter. Mm-hmm. What situations were they violating those terms, and how, in practical matters, was that resolved?
Oh, that's quite a difficult question, one that I would probably have to come back to you a bit on. But in general, I mean, Magna Carta covered all sorts of different things. I think there's a few people around who are also aficionados of the rights in Magna Carta granted to people using fishing weirs and things like that. So it's not just the things about the king and the baronage and scutage and tax and all that. There are different elements in Magna Carta to do with the day-to-day life of normal people and how lords, as well as the king, should act. So it could be to do with that in the localities, as well as it repeats that line again, perhaps about justice, the King's justice. So again, the barons can't just go in, and people can't just go in and arrest people just for no reason whatsoever. So it could be a whole host of different reasons under the 37 clauses of Magna Carta that people have sort of infringed on that charter or the Charter of the Forest.
Any other questions? Is there anything in the chat? No? David.
Well, thank you for a panoramic survey. I was reminded of just one personal anecdote, which is looking at the wonderful chapel of St. Catherine's Chapel, the infirmary chapel of Westminster Abbey, which is, I used to have a vegetable garden there as a little boy, and I used so much water to sort of fertilize it that my mother, I always remember my mother scaring me and saying that the water board was going to make a complaint. That this is back in the 1950s, but it's a wonderful thing. I was wondering why you thought that the chapter on free elections was left out in the later charters, and whether John's Charter of Free, which of course is referred to, John's Charter of Free Elections, was still considered valid in the 13th century. Any light on that?
That's an extremely good question. As far as I'm aware, it would probably be because the Pope had already sort of enforced it as well. So there was that sort of double element to it. And I think perhaps in many ways by Henry, because of course Stephen Langton had been that architect in 1216 and 1217 to help change Magna Carta. I would have to go and have a look and see what the 1216 and 17 clause 1 is like. And it may be that perhaps Stephen Langton, if he was the architect behind that change, had thought that because the Pope was the one now enforcing it, that it no longer needed to be said in the Charter.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. That was great. I know that you have done a lot of work on miracle collections. And so one of the things I was wondering as you were talking, because you gave a really, I think, great overview of why this was in the church's political interests, right? But I wondered, and perhaps we don't have evidence of this, or it's not, in your opinion, relevant, but I wondered whether you could suggest anything about the kind of spiritual aspect of this, because obviously the excommunication ceremony is very dramatic. It's obviously kind of political import, but I believe that, these people were also very devoutly religious, right? And so I wondered if you could comment at all on what you thought the kind of spiritual dimensions or religious dimensions of this support might be. Is it something to do with kingship? Is it something to do with, so just anything that you can offer on that would be very interesting to me. And thank you again.
I think in part it does relate back to that, just the spiritual authority of the church was something not to generally be questioned during the period. There's a fantastic scene, sort of in terms, again, talking excommunication and its implications, of the famous dispute between Thomas Cantilupe and Gilbert de Clare, the Red Earl of Gloucester, where the Red Earl and the Earls of Gloucester had managed to erode the bishop's lands at the Bishop's Chase in Malvern. And so when Cantilupe had realized, hold on a second, I have lost a lot of my hunting grounds, I'm going to take the Earl to court, we have this very vivid depiction of sort of the Earl riding into the court, fully armored, all of his foresters in armor, and saying that no one will take from him what he and his ancestors have enjoyed in peace. And Cantilupe then apparently sort of considered this, went off to a nearby copse, and suddenly then put on full episcopal vestments, got his clergy to put on their vestments, and then walked back towards where where Gilbert de Clare was, and started hurling anathemas and excommunication. And you find then, sort of about a year later, that in Cantilupe's register, some of the foresters have then started suing for absolution. Please forgive me, you know. And there's a similar case. I think Felicity Hill mentions it as well, where there are 3 vills that have been taken possession by Llywelyn, the Welsh prince, and Cantilupe sort of goes up to Bishop's Castle in Shropshire, and he performs this excommunication ritual where he and the clergy just spend time throwing lighted candles into the moat around the castle to pronounce this sentence of excommunication on the vills. And these people, as you say, because it's a profoundly religious society of the time, and the people from these vills come and sue for absolution from the bishop. So it's one of those that I think perhaps it was to make Magna Carta enforceable, because the Council of 25 didn't work, the conciliar government under Simon de Montfort didn't work, but the one thing that did work in some ways was that threat of excommunication, and you have that vivid theatre reminding you of, oh damn, that's going to happen to me if I don't toe the line.
Where did the Magna Carta take effect in Wales?
That's perhaps more of a question for David, I think, because David will know far more than me on whether or not it was enacted in Wales.
Did it affect down in Llantwit Major down there? Because that was very early Christianized, wasn't it?
I would assume it had some effect in Wales. That certainly one of the things in Magna Carta is the fact that I think the 1215 in particular does refer to the rights of the marchers, and it is referred to as a separate sort of set of rights and customs and things like that. And as we all know, sort of Mortimer History Society, the King's Writ didn't run in the march. So it might have just been one of those things that the march was due to follow its own customs as it had done throughout the period, and Magna Carta may not have been in full effect here.
I'm getting my steps in. I'm keeping count on my watch.
You mentioned, well, no, actually, it wasn't you. It was at one of the talks earlier that Stephen Langton was inspired to promote the restrictions on the king embodied in the charter. He was inspired by biblical precedent.
Yes.
It wasn't merely the convenience of the current church. It was also because, from what was said anyway, a belief in the principle that was involved. Have you anything to say on that?
Well, it was David Davry who wrote a fantastic article a few years ago, which explored Langton's background as a theologian and his own theological studies. And some of the surviving works, I do believe, do indicate that based on Langton's own sort of examinations of the Bible, as you said, then it became one of those things that he strongly supported this idea that through the Bible, kings were subordinate to God, and who are the people who are kind of closest to God in that regard in the kingdom. It's usually sort of the bishops just underneath the king, and therefore it's the bishops who are then the ones who could sort of speak that truth. And it was through his use of biblical scripture that he was able perhaps to come up with this idea that the king should be subordinate to law.
Okay, there's time for a final question, if there is one. No. Okay, I think that means that it's time to be people going home. But before we do, if we could just thank Ian and all the speakers. I think it's been a